Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We will begin our webinar shortly, but first, a few housekeeping items. We invite you to join us again on Friday, June 2nd, for NYU Metro Center's Prioritizing Equity Conference. Past, present, and future. Bans on pronouns, books, and the passage of legislation to erase Black history underscore the need for equity in this very moment. NYU Metro Center's Prioritizing Equity Conference permits education leaders the opportunity to learn and to share critical education justice practices. The Prioritizing Equity Conference is proud to feature the Dean of the University of Southern California's Rosier School of Education and former Metro Center Executive Director, Dr. Pedro Noguera, as its keynote speaker. Do not miss out. This conference is a little bit more than a week away. Be sure to visit our website to review the agenda, the various conference descriptions, and most importantly, register. NYU Metro Center's Prioritizing Equity Conference happening next Friday. Do not pass up the opportunity to meet education equity leaders from across the country and engage in dialogue, learning, and community. Hello, everyone. My name is Pharaoh Cranston. I'm the Director of Communications here at NYU Metro Center. I will be your moderator for this discussion. Today's conversation will be recorded and made available to all webinar attendees in a few days. Closed caption services can be enabled for this webinar. We invite all of our attendees to introduce yourselves to this community. Please type your name and the state you're joining us from and your educational role in the chat. We also encourage you to share questions for our panelists using the Q&A feature. If you're active on social media, please feel free to live tweet this conversation using the hashtag NYU Metro Center. Now, the housekeeping chores out of the way, let's get to know our esteemed panelists for today's discussion. Ron Wu is the Executive Director of the New York State Statewide Language Regional Bilingual Resource Network, RBERN. Ron is an educator with more than 50 years of experience in public school and higher education. He enjoys expertise in educational policy and law, second language acquisition, and educational leadership and teacher preparation. During his career in the public school system, Ron served in multiple senior policy and administrative leadership positions, including superintendent. During his time in higher education, Ron has seen alternative teacher certifications and senior policy positions. Up next, Nancy Viral de Adler, Executive Director of the New York State Association for Bilingual Education, commonly known as NYSABE. Nancy, as well, has over 50 years of service in the field of education. She has served as the Director of the Office of Bilingual Special Education Services citywide programs with the New York City Board of Education. Nancy's administrative experiences also include serving as the Director of Magnet Schools District 1, Director of the Bilingual Multicultural Institute, and Director of the Office of Special Education Funded Programs, again with the New York City Board of Education. Fun fact, Nancy would become the first bilingual teacher in Central New York in 1970. She would rise throughout her career to hold posts as a staff developer, curriculum specialist, and coordinator for the bilingual ESL program in Syracuse. thank you for joining us today, Ron, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be with you. Let's start with our first question. NYU Metro Center work focuses on youth who have been historically marginalized in educational spaces. In order to ground this conversation, we'd first like to start by defining several essential terms. Nancy, could you get us started by explaining what is meant by bilingualism?
Hello, everybody. Bilingualism is the ability to communicate in two languages. Bi meaning two, bilingualism, two languages. It's the presence of two languages in a person's life. Okay? But linked to that is also the ability to appreciate, honor, and behave in such a way that not only you understand one culture, but two cultures. But beyond understanding is the ability to honor these two cultures at the same time that your ability to communicate, speak, read, and write in two languages. So I do not separate the ability to speak and perform orally from the ability to connect that to culture. That for me is bilingualism.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Ron, a question for you. Can you explain what multilingual or multicultural is and explain why it is important?
Oh, well, hi, everyone. I'm pleased to be here today. Well, multiculturalism really describes how people behave in a culturally diverse society. If you're not multiculturalism just allows you the ability to negotiate between different cultures in your immediate grouping. So one doesn't have to speak multiple languages, but one has to be able to understand the culture and the differences between different cultures so that they are able to negotiate with the different people that are around them, different ethnic groups, different cultural groups, different religious groups, where the philosophies and the religions and nationalities are different, but yet they have the ability to negotiate between and among all of them.
Okay, thank you, Ron. Born of the dream of achieving equity in public education, NYU Metro Center was founded in 1978 by NYU professor Dr. Lamar P. Miller. Miller's vision was to examine and to find solutions for problems facing the country's public schools, especially as they affect low-income and minority children. Ron, what were the problems English language learners or bilingual language learners were facing in public schools in the late 1960s and 1970s?
Well, I think that's a rather simple question, Pharaoh. In the 60s and in the 70s, there were no bilingual programs. There were really no formal programs to assist those youngsters who did not speak English as their first language. I mean, what happened after World War II was the United States was faced with new language speakers, primarily from our returning GIs with their GI wives and having children that did not have English as a first language. And we also had a large immigration in New York State from Puerto Rico and other areas. So with the lack of formal education for them, formalized or structured education for them, they were left to flounder.
I guess posing that question, what would the Metro Center do to help facilitate and support this community, or these communities rather, excuse me?
Well, I think what Metro Center was able to do, because Metro Center at that time was an EAC, it was an Equity Assistance Center, and one of the areas that they dealt with was an area called national origin, for which our non-English speakers fell into. in many ways, they helped to advocate for services for this particular population. And it's through that advocacy work that we were able to achieve some level of service, at least at the onset. And then later on, as after Lau versus Nichols and after the Equity Civil Rights Act of 1964, we were able to achieve more services. So Metro Center was an advocate for us.
Okay, may I add something?
Please do, please do.
Yeah, I think that our partnership, the partnership between New York SABE and Metro Center has helped us in many areas. Let's talk about legislation, for example. When we, in the year 2014, we were participating in the revision of Part 154. We had the participation not only of the urban-based here, but other people like Pedro Noguera, okay, hosted that revision. So we gathered people from all other universities, we gathered people from other institutions, but it took place here. This is where the revision was born and was held, and I will always thank Metro Center for hosting that tremendous, tremendous task.
Yeah, I think so. So Pharaoh, I mean, your question was about the late 60s and 70s. The Metro Center has had a long history in helping English language learners. I mean, it goes back, Nancy touched on what happened in 2014, but prior to 2014, Metro Center hosted a number of symposiums. One of the big ones was the one on students with interrupted formal education in the 1997. An outcome of that was a set of proceedings that actually became foundational in the work around students with interrupted formal education. And beyond that, it's hosted parent conferences for English language learner parents. Most recently, in March of 2017, it issued a document called Effective Practices for Holistic Education of English language learners in New York State. So Metro Center has been involved in multiple ways, including hosting the Auburn, and prior to hosting the Auburn, hosted the Bilingual Education Technical Assistance Centers.
Mm-hmm.
So it's had a long and rich history in supporting English language learners.
Right, and also let's be reminded that Metro Center has participated in our annual conference distantly for many, many years. And also we held one of our annual conferences here, sponsored by Metro Center. We held it here at the NYU campus. So it has been a combination of sharing the expertise of people here, but also being co-sponsored and acting like real partners. Thank you very much, Metro Center.
Oh, no, thank you indeed. Thank you indeed. I guess I'm, somewhat. Yeah, I guess take a moment to recognize and ask the question: how do we get here? Like Ron, I'd imagine when we started, our initial question was about the 1960s and 70s. However, I'd imagine in the United States, bilingual education always didn't face such a hurdle or impediment. Ron, can you kind of brief us on the history of bilingual education here in the United States?
So how far back do you want me to go, Pharaoh?
Oh, well, listen, you can take us to the 1830s or 40s.
Okay, so look, what's clear about bilingual education in the United States is that it's sort of been a bumpy road. I guess that's the best way to describe it. I mean, in the early 1700s and 1800s, when the U.S. was at its infancy, it was a permissive period for bilingual education. English was not a precondition to be an American. Multilingualism was valued. Schools used native language for instruction. As a matter of fact, the first bilingual education school was established in Ohio. It was a German English program. But as things change politically and otherwise, between the late 1800s to World War II, to the end of World War II, it was sort of a restrictive period. I mean, this was a period where there was anti-Catholic immigration, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, and in 1905 and 1924, there were laws restricting Japanese immigration. There was the Nationality Act of 1906, which required all immigrants seeking naturalization to speak English in the United States. Further, in 1923, 34 states had laws mandating English-only instruction. It was an interesting period. So it was rather restrictive. But good news gets to come along after World War II. Something just popped up on my screen. After World War II, we had the Civil Rights Act, and we also had Brown versus Board of Education Topeka, which allowed for education of youngsters regardless of race and color and that kind of thing, and which served as a basis for our national origins people to be able to find instruction that would help them. So it was an opportunistic period for us. That plus the fact that in 1963, the first bilingual program was established in Florida, and then followed that by Lau versus Nichols in 1974, which really paved the way for bilingual education, not necessarily bilingual education, but for the education of English language learners. It required states to provide opportunities for those who don't speak English. And the other thing that happened is in the mid-60s, the immigration laws were changed in 1965. Prior to 1965, the immigration laws really was Eurocentric. So most of the immigrants are coming from Europe. But after 1965, we had a new range of immigrants coming from the Far East, from China, from Japan, from Korea, from Africa, and other nations, which created another grouping of folks that required English language services. And it was also a period of political action. And I think Nancy can talk a little bit about some of that political action through things like Aspira versus the New York City Department of Education. That created a groundswell for the need for English language learner activities. But unfortunately, good things happen and bad things come along.
Yes, but the good thing that happened at that time of the Aspira consent decree, even though it was born here in New York City and it was into that, defended the linguistic and educational rights of Hispanic, Latino children, had an effect on the rest of the state.
That's right.
I'm talking about the rest of the state, meaning central New York and cities like Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo. It was a wake-up call for all of us and the opportunity to grab the occasion in order to start thinking and creating new programs. I'm talking about the late 60s, early 70s. So I remember the people, my friends from Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse getting together and coming to New York City to see what you guys were doing so we could follow and support. So the point that in 1972, approximately, we brought some people from New York City to central New York, and they were on television telling the whole world about this movement of bilingual education, the education of English language learners who were not called English language learners then, the education of the foreign kids. That's what we call the foreign kids. So, but whatever happened here in New York City in the early 70s had a tremendous effect in the rest of the state. We are copycats.
Well, I wouldn't call them copycats, Nancy. I would say that finally there was a recognition that there were English language learners outside of New York City. What a surprise for the rest of the state that we had pockets of English language learners in the large cities across the entire state of New York, in central parts of New York, and scattered in the smaller school districts as well.
Right.
It's like, oh my God, we had an awakening. And things started to move. But unfortunately, as good fortune goes, there's a turnaround. In the early 1980s, we start what I would call a dismissive period for bilingual education. We had this fellow by the name of S.I. Hayakawa in 1981, who was a state senator from California, who said we should have English as an official language of the U.S. Right, and then that was followed by a withdrawal of the Lao remedies from the federal government, and then we also saw things like Proposition 227 in California eliminating bilingual programs.
Wow, yeah.
And we saw multiple states passing anti-bilingual education laws in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And then in 2002, with the then new No Child Left Behind Act, the Office of Bilingual Education at the federal level had a name change. The name change was to the Office of English Language Acquisition, OELA. What does that say about the focus around bilingual education? It's been dismissed, it's been put aside. But, I'm hopeful. I hope we will go beyond that. Here we are in the 2020s, right? Yes, I would call this a period of possible uncertainty or a possible promising period. Yes, we have a continuation with when Mr. Trump was president, that there was a continuation of this anti-immigrant sentiment across New York, across the world, across the United States, which may continue to impede bilingual education. But we also have Joe Biden, who just became president in 2020, who has Mr. Cardona as the Undersecretary of Education, who said at this year's National Association for Bilingual Education, a resurgence of bilingual education in the United States. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully it's more promise than uncertainty, but we shall see. But as I said, it's a bumpy road. I wish I had a crystal ball.
Well, Nancy, let me ask you a question here. In terms of the things you are hopeful for, or your forecast for the future for bilingual education, what do you see? What are you hopeful for?
Let me pull my crystal ball. What I'm hoping that will happen is that we have a wake-up call, not just among people who are involved in bilingual education or people who are involved in the education of ENL students. This wake-up call has to be beyond that. I would like to see the educational community being together to look at the linguistic and cultural experience of the students as an integral part or as an asset that will be a foundation of the education of all kids. That's what we need. One of the things that we need here. We need to look at language and culture as assets for everyone, not just for certain populations.
So Pharaoh, I'm going to be bold. I'm going to say, ask me the same question. What do I foresee?
Ron, I'm asking you the same question.
Thank you. So I'm an optimist. I believe that that bilingual education and multicultural education is going to continue. I mean, here we are sitting here in 2023, looking at a shrinking world, looking at how all of us are going to be in a globally competitive society. And if we're unable to negotiate other cultures, how are we going to be globally competitive? We need to have the language skills. Beyond the language skills, we also need to have the cultural understandings, going back to multicultural, all this, the understandings to negotiate between and among the different worlds. One of the things that New York State has done that is helping to do that is promoting the seal of biliteracy, so that all youngsters are going to be able to be bilingual, if not multilingual, by the time they graduate high school. It's significant. I mean, if you look around, there is a huge demand for youngsters who speak multiple languages. So I remain optimistic.
Yeah. But to talk to me a little bit more about this, right? We live in a time, and I'm seeing this pop up in the chat as well, where there's a demand, there's a desire for dual immersion programs, right? And
Right.
you guys both touched on it, but this idea that, oh, wait, the idea of shifting from having a foreign language, speaking a foreign language, from that being a deficit to an asset. When does that happen?
So let's be very careful when we talk about that. There's a perception that youngsters who do not speak English at birth comes with a deficit. However, there is a recognition among our growing middle class that there is a need for a second language. And it's that tension that you're hearing out there. And it's how do we connect the two to make them whole, to have an understanding that those youngsters who do not come with English in the first instance, have an asset that is shareable. They have experiences, they have knowledges that others may not. And how do we gather the two to come together to push forward the notion that we are living in a shrinking global world and a shrinking global economy, that we have to be competitive in it? I mean, you don't have to go too far. I mean, you go to our utilities right now in New York City. If you're with any one of the electrical companies and you want service, you call up and say, if you want English, press 1. If you want another language, press 2. If you want another language, press 3. Any one of the utility companies, the cable companies, a lot of the international companies are doing exactly the same thing. They're hiring multinationals to be competitive across the world.
Nancy, I saw you shaking your head.
Yeah. Yes, it's an optimistic way, and I agree with Ron. Okay, we have an optimistic sense, but I'm comparing the way we used to feel in the 70s, early 70s, and the way we feel about the world of bilingual education now. At least I'm talking about from my own perspective as a bilingual education practitioner. Okay? I remember in the 70s, people telling me about bilingualism and biliteracy as something cute, something sweet, something adorable. Oh, the kids can sing in Spanish. Oh, look how beautiful, how cute. It was that sense of being something that looked cute, you know? But very few people will tell me that there is research-based practices that will promote intellectual growth. You see the difference between cuteness and talking about research-based practices, research-based school environment where all languages and cultures are honored, respected, and used for academic growth. There is a big difference, and I hope that we keep on growing in that direction. Thank you.
Oh, man, that makes perfect sense. Ron, before I come back to you, let me also take a moment to remind our audience that if you hear something that really is stimulating, you want to share it with other people, by all means, please engage some of the social media platforms using the hashtag NYU Metro Center. Also, please feel free to engage our Q&A section. Be part of this. You're invited very much to be part of this conversation. So add a question there and we will ask it of Ron and Nancy. Ron, go ahead. You had a point.
I think I needed to say what I had to say about being multicultural and multilingual.
Okay.
I remain positive. I'm hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, we touched on a lot already. And kind of in passing, the Bilingual Education Act of 1968, right? The idea of decriminalizing instruction, foreign language instruction in classrooms. Lau versus Nichols, requiring schools to take affirmative steps to overcome language barriers impeding children's access to curriculum. Again, you both mentioned you're hopeful. What are the key priorities or initiatives or challenges you see that bilingual education needs to encounter today?
You want me to take this, Nancy, or you want to?
No, go ahead. Then okay.
Well, Farrell, bilingual education today, I think there are different avenues that one has to look at. We are living in a more technological society now. The notion is, how does bilingual education fit within technology, within the career and technical education world? Is there a fit, or must we all be monolingual in technology? So there's an issue around there. I mean, in New York State, we're looking at doing away with what many states are doing across the United States, and that's doing away with pen to paper tests, moving more toward performance-based learning and performance-based assessments. What will that look like for our English language learners? So there are different fronts that bilingual education will need to confront over the next number of years. But I'd like to go back to something that you said that I'd like to just sort of correct, I guess, or make more clear, and that the Bilingual Education Act of 1968 did not decriminalize bilingual education, as you stated, Farrell, but merely provided an opportunity for competitive grants for bilingual education. Because at that time, as I said earlier, bilingual education really did not exist in any kind of structured or researched form. So it was promoting competitive grants to experiment with, to find those kinds of instructional strategies as necessary. It wasn't until the 1970s that bilingual education, or even later than that, the Bilingual Education Act was transformed to a categorical aid package to the states. In those early years, they were still looking for solutions.
Well, during that time, Ron, what did the advocacy look like?
Well, the advocacy was, what do we need to do for our youngsters? And the question before many of our educators was, we're not really sure. We know that they needed some kind of support. Lau versus Nichols was very clear in that you just can't have youngsters flounder by themselves. They need some kind of support. The research around the education of English language learners was there. And the Bilingual Education Act of '68 was to help promote finding those solutions, those instructional solutions. It helped. And then what we found was schools like NYU was at the front end of clinical practices for English language learners. that now have created a groundswell of research that enables educators to choose from a range of different strategies to teach English language learners. And they continue to be enhanced because what we are doing is we're refining the different populations of English language learners. It was no longer one size fits all. If you went back to 1968, you would have one solution. Now we have multiple solutions because we now understand the different subgroupings of English language learners. What does it look like for a newcomer English language learner? What does it look like for an English language learner that is a long-term English language learner? What does it look like for an English language learner that has an IEP? What does it look like for an English language learner that comes with interrupted formal education? We now have more and more understanding of our English language learner population, better defined with better solutions, better instructional solutions. We've come a long way. We're not fully there yet.
No.
Moving.
Yes, I agree with you, Ron, that when you say that we have come a long way, I didn't say baby, but we have come a long way. One of the biggest big steps taken over the years is that they look at the stakeholders. We used to believe, and a lot of people used to tell us that we educators in the classroom were the ones coming with the solutions. But nowadays I see people joining together, and stating that the responsibility of the education of our kids is not just the persons in the classroom, it's the entire community that needs to be involved. That is one of the reasons why we reach out to institutions of higher education, to community organizations, educational organizations such as NYSABE, such as NABE, all kinds of organizations. So the community that is bringing us support and different perspectives are joining forces with us in order to assume that responsibility of education, of educating our kids. So that's why I always welcome different groups of people trying to join us educators.
But let me just add a bit to that. Not all educators are on board with the notion of educating English learners. There are still educators who would say, "Oh, they don't speak English; they belong somewhere else." Here in New York State, at least we have a blueprint for success for English language learners, where we have a belief system that all teachers are teachers of English language learners. In New York State, over the years, we have become a center for bringing on more immigrant students. I mean, take a look at New York City, the number of buses coming from Texas. Forget about just them. What about the Ukrainian refugees that are coming into not just New York City, but other parts of New York State that we see a growth in them?
Yeah.
So New York State continues to see a growth in its English language learner population. And it's our belief that somewhere along the way, each teacher will touch an English language learner. An expectation that all of our teachers in the state of New York would be a teacher of an English language learner somewhere along the way, and should be skilled. I mean, what's fortunate in New York State is that we have regulations that require, at least for certain segment of our teaching corps, that they have to have a certain number of professional development hours toward English language acquisition skills. It's required, not just for the teachers, but also for the school leadership corps. But the notion still remains, as Nancy said, how do we get all of the educational community to embrace that single notion that all educators are educators of L's? Because in many segments of our population, of our school systems, they're still segregated. And that's what we're trying to figure out, how to have that embracing done.
Well, before we get further into that, let me address bring in one of the questions from the chat that Abby asked. Thank you for sharing the question, Abby. And again, if you have more questions, please enter them in the Q&A. Abby's question: where can we go to learn about research-based practices for undergraduates and future teachers?
Well, many of our, I guess here's a dilemma in teacher preparation programs. I assume this is a question about teacher preparation programs. There are two sides to that coin. And many of the schools of education have moved from clinical practice institutions to research institutions for education. And so if you go to schools like Teachers College or Stanford or Harvard or Peabody or any of those are research institutions. NYU used to be a clinical institution until it became, over the last 10 years, have transformed itself to a research-based institution. You need a blending of both. If you go to the research institutions, you should be able to find research on a variety of things that impact analysis. The real question then becomes, great, we have this fantastic research. How do we transform those research notions and theories into practice? And that's where you need the blending of the clinical people to come together with the research people to create those opportunities for teacher preparation. And I think if you go to our teacher preparation institutions of higher ed, you'll see more and more of that. You'll see a blending of our methods, the so-called methods classes or the clinical practices portion being taught by actual practitioners in the field rather than the researchers. I'm not sure, Abby, if I answered your question or not, but.
May I add something?
Oh, please do, Nancy, please do.
Yes, yes. I just wanted to mention that NYSABE disseminates the JMER, which is the Journal of Multilingual Education Research. It's conducted by Dr. Aida Nevares. And now it's not just for the United States members, it's going international now and contains a lot of interesting research for people who are interested in looking at what's the latest in research here in the United States. I just wanted to mention that it's called JMER, Journal of Multilingual Education Research. And a lot of people in other countries are talking about that, the excellence of that research. I just wanted to mention and brag a little bit.
No, thank you, Nancy. And again, for our audience, if you check the chat, there's a link for the journal there. Thank you, Paloma, for that. Another audience question. Can you share an example of something that is exciting to you in the world of ELS today? Current practices, theories. What excites you?
What excites me is the seal of biliteracy and the movement toward everybody graduating with being bilingual and if not multilingual. The only caveat I have to that is it's unfortunate in the way schools are structured that our English language learners are not necessarily beneficiaries of that because of the lack of continuity from grade level to grade level. I'll give you an example, or even some of our other students who are in the same predicament. We have dual language programs, primarily in the elementary schools. Youngsters starts on the road to bilingualism in those dual language programs. Come middle school, what happens in the movement from elementary school to middle schools? Very often there are no middle schools that have dual language programs that continue that language instruction. So there's a break in the continuity of instruction. And similarly, moving from middle school to high school, what happens in high school then is you pick up quote, the foreign language or the world language option. And that is sort of a re-beginning for a certain group of youngsters who did not have a language other than English at the front end. So you're losing that continuity of instruction. If we can somehow find better ways of ensuring a continuity of language instruction from K through 12, it would really benefit all of us.
Ron, and everybody else. I would like to say a little bit about the seal of biliteracy. It's a perfect example of how communities united, got together, joined forces in order to make sure that New York State would finally have a seal of biliteracy. And to remember the meetings that we held with the people in California and trying to have that, but then we were able to have like a movement, a campaign, and we reached out to other organizations, even people in other groups that were not necessarily bilingual, but they supported the seal of biliteracy. It was extensive work for all of us, particularly the people in New York SABE, and we made it possible. And it's not perfect, the implementation, we are aware that the implementation is not where we would like to see it. However, it was a big, big step. And one of the things that I remember discussing during the New York SABE conference is that the pathway towards the seal of biliteracy does not begin in high school. In the first time that the child steps into school, early childhood. And that's what we call the pathways of the seal of biliteracy, long-term. And the fact that there are a lot of children who enter dual language programs, bilingual education programs, in order to acquire the seal of biliteracy, have to leave those programs without completing the years required for the seal of biliteracy. That is really something that worries me.
Exactly, Nancy, that's exactly right. The pathway to a seal of biliteracy should start from the beginning of school to high school, but structurally, it's disjointed in such a way that the continuity of instruction doesn't exist. You're absolutely right.
Now, that problem, Ron, is that a matter of funding, support? There are times we hear of a shortage of bilingual educators. What can we do to change that?
Well, I think you have different problems. One, we have structural issues around that there is no clear pathway from one level of schooling to another. Secondly, you're right, we are facing a shortage of second language teachers, both as world language teachers as well as bilingual teachers. There is a shortage. I mean, the state recognizes that. The state also has something called a intensive institute, teacher institute to promote bilingual teachers. But they are few and far in between. I will tell you that our world language teacher population is, I'll have to quote somebody else who said to me, they're fading fast, Ron. The schools of higher education are not producing enough of them at enough of a rate to backfill all of those positions. So it's a combination of things. And yeah, it's a combination of things.
Okay. Nancy, before I get to you again, I want to invite those in the audience. Thank you for being with us today. And again, if you have questions, now is the time to get them in to the Q&A so we can ask them of our esteemed panelists. We're again, speaking of our panelists, we're talking to the leaders of New York SABE, Auburn. Nancy, can you explain what New York SABE is, how it works, and I guess what you would point to as maybe the accomplishments you were most proud of?
right now, okay. The purpose of New York SABE is to promote the establishment, maintenance, and expansion of high-quality bilingual education programs. High quality meaning with the practices of research-based practices. Practices that have been successful, and that's what we would like to see. Okay, and also the advocacy work that we have done over the years for public recognition of the importance of bilingualism and biliteracy as a path toward equitable participation in a global, multilingual, and multicultural world. Okay, so within that, I've been looking at the this document, the CRS framework, what it says, and if it contradicts New York SABE's beliefs, or maybe they are here one follows the other. For example, when CRS talks about welcoming and affirming environment, affirming what? Affirming the value of diverse languages, affirming the value and using other cultures, multiple cultures, in order to create a good foundation for the children to grow academically. And that is exactly what New York SABE and what bilingual education is saying. We want quality education on best practices that affirm, honors, respects the language and the experiences, educational or life experiences, academic experience, everything that the child brings to the classroom. Okay. That is one of the things that really excites me. And the work, I already talked about the work in advocacy, okay, professional development, and the dissemination of good practices through our JMER, through our newsletters. Those are things that I really, really appreciate in New York SABE, and I like to promote that. Going back to the work of the advocacy work of New York SABE, we have done extensive work in advocacy during the past 50 or more years. And we are not going to stop doing it. We must continue our advocacy, but we are not standing alone. Please, let's not stand alone. We have to create that strong network of community members. And that's where we have to go back. We have to go back to that networking where the entire community is united to fight for our children. New York SABE says so, and CRS says so. So there are so many, and when I look at both documents, I see the parallel, and I'm very proud of that. Thank you very much.
I just want to add to what Nancy said about NYSABE. One of the things that she didn't mention, which is the great range of professional workshops that are offered at the annual conference, high quality workshops that all of our educators of English language learners would benefit from. So I would just add that too.
Thank you, Ron.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Well, one of the questions that came in, again from Abby, how does translanguaging compare, contrast, or fit with bilingualism?
Well, that's sort of an interesting kind of question. I guess, well, one has to understand what translanguaging is. I mean, translanguaging is using one's full repertoire of linguistic skills to communicate. how does it contrast or fit with bilingualism? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, Abby, if you can come back to the Q&A, give us a little more information, that'd be great. Well, Ron, how would you describe your work with Auburn?
My work, I think it's, I think we do great work. We have so let me start with Auburn, what we do. I mean, we are state funded. We are there to provide support to schools and school districts across the state about for English language learners and world language teachers. We host the New York State hotline for parents. It's the only one in the state where if a parent of an English language learner, or if a parent has an issue around discrimination, bullying, or otherwise, they can call our office, and we are the recipient of those questions for the entire state. We have a very robust set of bilingual glossaries that are used for accommodations, testing accommodations for English language learners during Regents Week or any other high stakes testing. Very often it's being used by our teachers, our bilingual teachers, who may or may not have, interestingly, the academic language in either in English or in their home language. Many of us are maybe speakers of a particular language, but we may not be able to be fully articulate in the academic language. So our bilingual glossaries help both populations, both the instructional and the student populations. It also helps parents to understand what their children are doing in their classrooms. We also have a very robust list of translated parent materials that talks about their rights and ways of how they can support their youngsters. A very robust listing of supports for ensuring that their youngster will graduate high school. We have a series around the roadmap to college, where we do workshops for parents and helping parents understand the FAFSA pieces. We did a series this year on immigration, immigrants, and understanding immigrants from Central America and Venezuela. And we are doing a special series around students with disabilities who are English language learners. We do a lot of work around anything that supports English language learners and world language students that are of interest to our educators and parents across the state.
All right. Now, again, in speaking with you, Ron, and with you, Nancy, talking to two individuals who've worked and continue to work more than 50 years apiece in this community doing this work. Now, I've been looking at the chat. A couple, a few people are raising very relevant questions. The idea that seems to some degree we're going through the same battles, whether it be resources, or the idea that too many of our elves do not have access to dual language programs. What creates that problem, and what are the solutions, or at least the advice that either of you can offer?
Well, if it seems like we're fighting the same battles over and over again, it's absolutely right. Bilingual education is one of these recycling issues. So depending on the politics du jour and the current sentiment across the nation, whether they are embracing of others or they are more trying to find the right word for it, where they're more singularly focused on a particular group, we will go back to the same cycle that we've seen over the last 150 years. So we'll go through a permissive period, we'll go through a dismissive period, we'll go through a period of uncertainty. This is cyclical.
Sarah?
Yes.
I would like to share something with you. We have talked about advocacy, professional development, communication and dissemination of information, and networking, but there's one aspect that I would like to focus on. Once upon a time, I asked the audience, what do you think I am doing here in New York SABE and wherever, in any position that I've been? So one person in the audience raised her hand, Dr. Sarah Nahari. She says, actually, Nancy, this is what you're doing. You're removing the rocks and everybody's, in a lot of people's road. You're trying to remove the rocks so that person can travel safely towards the achievement of his or her goals. So I went home thinking about it, and I said, that is something that I love to do, to create leadership, to promote leadership, because as Dr. Sarah Nahari said to me that day, you guys are not going to be here forever. So Ron and Nancy are not going to be here forever. We have to be realistic about it, and we need to continue creating leadership in the world of bilingual education. So Ron, you and I have a duty to remove the rocks on people's road so they can walk towards really sound leadership and continue the work that we are doing now. Thank you. Thank you. And that's what you're doing too, Ron.
I'm trying every day.
You're doing it very nicely. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you both. Nancy, Ron, for joining us today. Thank you, audience, for your questions, your participation, and your passion and the energy you bring to this work. Hopefully, again, we recognize it's imperfect, but we hopefully hopeful going forward. We can take our cues from Ron and Nancy in terms of the commitment and the change and really the need for steady progress forward. So again, we thank our panelists for sharing their insights with us today. To our audience, again, thank you for joining us. After this conversation, we hope that you are better informed and more empowered to go out and advance equity in your school, your workplace, and community. Thank you for joining us. Thank you again to Nancy, to Ron, for audience, and be well and take care as we conclude today's webinar.
And thank you for inviting us, Farrell.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.